Alright, this should be a shorter lecture. I'm just going to cover the main points and let you read the descriptions along the way. This is the chapter on memory, and we know that memory is the ability to store, and then you have to hold on to what you store. That's called retention, and the ability to recall information. So from a biological level, we understand that when you memorize something, you alter the structure of your brain. We talked about the brain being plastic and capable of change. So once you upload new information into your brain, the brain stores that information by utilizing brain cells, neurons, to fire along a different pattern than they've ever fired before. And so prior to memorization of a piece of knowledge, these are individual neurons here. This might be the pattern that those neurons took. Once you've memorized by repetition, or the other methods of memorizing we'll talk about, those neurons now may look like this. They may have moved closer together. Most certainly they've stretched out their dendrites and axons to come into contact with each other. And it's not just the way they fire, it's the pattern that they fire in. And so if we were to look at a brain scan and look at a single memory, we would see this. This right here is a memory. That's how your brain stores memories. Now, this memory may be related to these events up here, and so when you recall this information, you might recall this information up here. Thus, just like if I asked you to recall your third grade teacher's face, maybe your brain accesses this part of itself to call up that recollection. But these neurons are also interconnected with these, and so while you're recalling her face, you're recalling your friends' names, what the classroom looked like, and that information is stored up here. Just for example. There are 3 stages of memory, just like there are several stages of inputting information into a computer. When you want to place information in your computer, you type in the information, and you know that your hard drive doesn't store letters A, B, C, D, it stores binary code. And so when you press the key on the keyboard, that letter is encoded in the only language the computer understands, which is binary code, a series of 1s and 0s. That's called encoding. Likewise, our brain doesn't store photographs or audio clips of sounds. It stores information in the form of neurons, electrochemical energy. So when you receive information through your sensory organs, you remember that that's transduced, and for memory we call that encoded, into a form that the brain can understand. Encoding involves that transition, and it also involves the growth of neurons. The growth of the neurons leads to the storage, the creation of a permanent record of that information. So you store that information in your memory, just like you would store information on an external hard drive or a zip drive. And then when you're ready to recall that information, have you ever stored anything in your computer that you forgot what you called it, you forgot which file you put it in, so you can't find it? That kind of highlights the issues with retrieval. Just because I can't retrieve something doesn't mean it's not stored. I just have to know where to look. Same for your brain. Every once in a while we store things in a way that when we're trying to recall them, there aren't enough cues to give our brain so that our brain can go searching for that information where it's stored. So memory also involves the ability to retrieve. What good is a memory that you can't retrieve? I'm going to slowly share this slide. I want you to think of your memory and the pattern that it stores information in 3 different steps. And as we think of those steps, think of warehouses. The warehouses where goods are stored could be analogous to the warehouse where information is stored. And so things happen outside of you. we're bombarded by millions and millions of bits of information every second, every split second. All of that information that enters into my brain through any of my sensory organs is stored for a brief second in what's called the sensory information storehouse. It's the biggest, it's a huge warehouse, not the biggest, but it's a huge warehouse, the analogy, in your brain, where all that information is received and stored for about a half a second to 1 second. The capacity is huge. What happens to that information? If it's not used, it's dumped. It's dumped out the back because new information is coming in the front. Millions and millions of bits of information are just moving through this warehouse very, very quickly. The vast majority of the information that we receive is ignored. The random sounds, the random smells, the sights, if we don't pay any attention to them, if we ignore that information, then that information is lost due to the interference of new information coming in. So it's dumped because it's not needed, and it's replaced immediately, thus being interfered with by new information coming in. Let's say that you're driving down the road, and one of the pieces of information that enters your sensory information storehouse is there's a red circle coming up. There's a red circle down the road a ways. Well, when you're driving, your brain knows what's pertinent, what's important, and what's not important, and red circles while driving are relatively important. So all of a sudden, your conscious mind it pays attention to that circle. You look to gather more information, and sure enough, it's a stop sign. Well, the moment that you recognize that red blip is a stop sign, you've attended to that information, and it's transferred from the sensory information storehouse, encoded into what we call short-term memory. Your short-term storehouse, that's also called working memory, is the area where your mind consciously holds pertinent information that you'll need to deal with in the moment. And since it's a very active portion, the duration of that information is about 20 to 30 seconds, and the capacity, however, is relatively small. I know there's a stop sign coming up. I acknowledge how I'm going to stop and what cars are behind me. And as soon as I pass that stop sign, I don't need that information anymore. I don't need to hold it for any longer than what I have. And so that information is replaced. I'm going to be an example of the capacity of short-term memory. I'm going to show you a grouping of letters, and I want you to just look at them. Don't write them down. Just look at them, try to take them all in. Okay, now how many of those letters can you remember? You can write them down, just recite them.
A, D, F, K, C, D.
If you remember more than 7, then you're in the upper end of short-term memory. If you remember less than 7, you're in the lower end of short-term memory. Very few of you can remember all 12. This is what they were: A, D, F, K, C, D, L, E, S, O, P, W. Each one of those is a bit of information. So the duration of, or the capacity of short-term memory has been measured at 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So that doesn't make sense, though. When you think about how much information you can hold in your short-term memory, you can hold an algebra problem in your short-term memory and maybe do it just in working memory without pen and paper. How does the brain manage such a small capacity? Let me show you that. Let me show you another grouping of letters. Okay, how many of those letters do you remember? Well, you probably remember all of them, because what your brain did was it chunked those bits into an orderly pattern. Dark, come, stew. All you have to do is spell those, and you remember every single letter in that list. That's how your brain manages the small capacity, is it chunks information together that you already recognize so that you can remember the chunk as a bit rather than the individual bits in the chunk. Way back in the day, we had to go to the phone book to look up a telephone number, and then we would close the phone book and we'd go to the telephone and dial the number very quickly before we forgot it, because we all instinctively know that we can only hold that information for so long. So let's say you do that, you look up a number, 8675309, you're going to go call that number, and somebody comes into the room and starts talking to you before you dial. What do you say to that person? Shh. You tell them to be quiet. Why? Because you know that their words are going to interfere with the number that you're trying to remember. So just like sensory information, storehouse information is dumped because we ignore it, and it's interfered with, and our recall of it is interfered with by new incoming information. Other information entering our short-term storehouse can interfere with our recall of the information we're trying to focus on in the moment. So short-term storehouse is information is lost due to interference. Now, I want you to remember this little shopping list. We're going to go to the grocery store and we're going to buy toilet paper, paper towels, grapes, oranges, and apples. Don't write it down. What are you doing? Most of you are repeating that information over to yourself in your mind. Toilet paper, paper towels, grapes, oranges, apples. I think that's what I said. That's called maintenance rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal is the most common way that we try to store information or maintain information in our short-term memory. It's also the way we tend to try to put it into long-term memory. We repeat it over and over and over and over and over and over. Very not fun way to do it. However, it's just the most common way that we try to convince our brain that this information is important enough to dedicate to long-term storage. If we do enough, if we engage in enough maintenance rehearsal, about 7 times usually, that information, it's as if we're convincing the brain this is important. And once the brain gets the message, this is important, it will encode that information, usually while you're sleeping, during your dreaming phase, REM sleep. It will encode that information into long-term storage. I hope you remember we talked about the hippocampus and its ability that's where your short-term memories reside, in your hippocampus. And what we do in maintenance rehearsal is it's called protein coding of those individual memories, and your brain goes and searches out those individual protein-coded memories while you're sleeping, and it stores them in long-term storage. The duration of long-term storage is infinite. Cells are designed to live for your 70 or 80 years of life, and that when they're formed in a pattern and they're used to firing in a pattern, they always maintain that pattern, barring illness or injury. And we also believe that the capacity of long-term storage is infinite. With 150 billion neurons, you are, and each of those neurons being able to communicate with 5,000 other neurons, you've got an infinite capacity. You'll never be able to fill up your long-term storage. However, we experience forgetting. So if the duration of what's stored is infinite and my brain will never be filled up, what's interfering? We're going to talk about interference in long-term storage in the next video, or next audio.